Late April 1945, somewhere east of the Ella River in Germany. The Jeep's engine idled quietly as Captain T. Moffat Burris gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white under the dirt and grime from 6 days of hard combat. The young paratrooper from South Carolina stared through the dusty windshield at a long column of German vehicles stretching as far as he could see. Behind him sat his lieutenant and a sergeant, their rifles ready, but clearly not strong enough for what lay ahead. In front of them waited 15,000 German soldiers of an armored Panzer Corps. The moment that followed would break every rule of military logic. 1 jeep, 3 American paratroopers, and 15,000 enemy troops with tanks, artillery, and automatic weapons. What happened next should not have been possible. Yet, within 30 minutes, the entire German force would lay down their arms without firing a single shot. This was not because of better firepower or smart tactics. It was because of one man's bold bluff and the psychological collapse of an army caught between 2 advancing superpowers. The path to this unbelievable moment started not in Germany, but in a small town in South Carolina. Thomas Moffat Burris was born in Anderson, South Carolina, on September 22, 1919. He grew up in the textile mill country of the South, where hard work and quiet determination shaped a whole generation. After graduating from Clemson University, Burris took a teaching job at Orangeburg High School. He described himself as an easygoing small-town boy who had not fought in years. He had been part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps at Clemson and held a Reserve Officer commission. It seemed like his future was set. A quiet life teaching history to teenagers in rural South Carolina. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the United States Pacific Fleet. Within days, America declared war on Japan. Just days later, Germany declared war on America. Burris got orders to report for active duty in January 1942. At age 22, the school teacher became a soldier, but Burris did not want to be an ordinary soldier. He volunteered for the paratroopers, the elite airborne infantry being formed into a new kind of fighting force. The training was very hard. Jump school pushed men to their physical and mental limits. Many dropped out. Burris did very well. He found something in himself he had never known before. A talent for leadership under pressure. An ability to stay calm when chaos erupted around him. A willingness to take smart risks that scared others. In April 1942, Burris was assigned to the newly forming 82nd Airborne Division. He became the very first officer assigned to 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 82nd was called the All-American Division because its soldiers came from every state in the Union. Burris trained alongside farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, cowboys from Texas, and dock workers from Brooklyn. Together, they would build one of the strongest fighting units in American military history. The 504th Parachute Infantry earned a different nickname from the Germans who fought them: Devils in Baggy Pants. The name came from a diary found on a dead German officer after the Battle of Anzio. The officer had written that American parachutists were devils in baggy pants, never more dangerous than when they were surrounded. The baggy pants meant the paratrooper uniforms, which were different from regular infantry straight-legged pants. It was a very high compliment from an enemy who rarely gave compliments. By May 1943, Burris and his regiment were sent to North Africa. His first combat jump came on July 9, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. The C-47 transport plane bounced through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Tracer rounds streaked past, causing fear and air sickness. When the green light flashed, Burris jumped into the darkness over enemy land. He landed in an olive grove, gathered his scattered platoon, and fought his way to the objective. It was the first of many times he would lead men into impossible situations. September 1943 brought the invasion of Italy at Salerno. The 504th jumped behind German lines to stop enemy reinforcements. Burris led his company through 5 days of non-stop fighting, often outnumbered always outgunned, but never defeated. Lieutenant General Mark Clark later said the 504th saved the Salerno beachhead. Then came Anzio in January 1944. The amphibious landing became a 4-month nightmare of trench warfare. German artillery pounded American positions every day. Casualties kept mounting. Burris was wounded twice but refused to be evacuated. He watched friends die in muddy foxholes. He learned that war was not about glory. It was about survival. And he learned how to keep men fighting when everything around them told them to surrender. But the most important moment of Burris's war came in September 1944. Operation Market Garden. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery made an ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas. Airborne forces would take bridges across the Netherlands, making a path for armored units to drive into Germany. The 82nd Airborne was ordered to capture the bridge over the Wall River at Naimi. It was a vital objective. Without it, the whole operation would fail. On September 20, 1944, Burris got the order that would test every lesson he had learned. His company would cross the wild river in collapsible canvas boats in broad daylight, under German machine gun and artillery fire. Then they would attack fortified positions on the far bank. It was a suicide mission by any measure. British officers said it was impossible. Burris's own men knew the odds, yet no one refused. 26 British canvas assault boats, each 19 feet long with plywood bottoms and wooden frames, were brought forward. Each boat was meant to carry 10 paratroopers plus 3 engineers, but they were packed with 13 paratroopers and 3 engineers, 16 men total. Most boats had only 2 or 3 paddles instead of the standard 8, forcing paratroopers to use rifle butts as improvised oars. The Wild River was 400 yards wide at the crossing point. German positions controlled every inch of the approach. The crossing started at 2:57 in the afternoon. As the boats pushed off from the southern bank, machine gun fire hit them immediately. Artillery shells exploded in the water. Men screamed and died. Boats flipped over. The river ran red. Burris led E Company in one of the 2 lead boats of the first wave. His boat took multiple hits in seconds. The engineer steering the boat, Private First Class Willard Jenkins, was killed by a 20mm Threader shell that shattered his head about 1/3 of the way across the river. His blood and brains spilled onto Burris's lap. Shrapnel from the same blast hit Burris in his ribs. Men fell all around him. The canvas sides tore open. Water poured in. They were sinking. Burris kept his men paddling. The crossing took 15 to 20 minutes of hell. They reached the far bank with only 6 men left from 16. Half his company had died in that crossing. Only 13 boats from the first wave reached the northern shore intact. Total casualties for the assault were between 24 and 48 killed, and about 70 seriously wounded. But they had made it across. Under deadly fire, Burris rallied the survivors. They charged the German positions, fighting hand-to-hand in the trenches, using grenades and bayonets. No mercy was asked and none was given. Inch by inch, they fought their way inland. By nightfall, they held the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. British tanks were supposed to follow and take advantage of their success immediately. 4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed the bridge around 7 in the evening. But then they stopped. Burris waited at the bridge. The tanks did not move. A British tank commander, Captain Peter Carrington, told Burris they could not advance without orders and because 1 German anti-tank gun blocked the road. Burris, who had just lost half his company taking that bridge, exploded with rage. "I have just sacrificed half of my company in the face of dozens of guns, and you will not move because of 1 gun?" Multiple American officers, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin himself, tried to convince the British forces to move forward. All failed. The tanks stayed in place for 18 to 24 hours, not moving until 11 in the morning on September 21st. By that time, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion at Arnhem Bridge, 11 miles away, had been overpowered. The British paratroopers, who desperately needed help, were forced to surrender. Years later, Lord Carrington, who became British Foreign Secretary, denied the confrontation in his autobiography, saying the exchange did not happen as described. But multiple American paratrooper accounts confirmed the incident and the intense frustration. The British halt had tactical reasons: shortages of ammunition and fuel, no infantry support, and an exposed elevated dike road not safe for tanks. The divide showed competing military cultures: aggressive paratrooper attitude versus the by-the-book guards mentality. Burris received the Silver Star for the Wall River crossing. The citation praised his brilliant and inspiring leadership and heroism in taking the north end of the vital Nijmegen Highway Bridge. But Burris knew the truth. Bravery had not won that battle. Audacity was the willingness to try what seemed impossible. The ability to bluff when the odds were hopeless. These lessons would help him 6 months later. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler launched his last desperate attack through the Ardennes forest. The 82nd Airborne rushed into combat with very little food, ammunition, or winter clothing. They were sent to Vermont, Belgium, and blocked a group of German forces at Chenau, giving the Germans their first defeat in the Battle of the Bulge. Burris and his men held their positions against German tanks and artillery. They fought in below-zero temperatures. They endured constant bombardment but did not give up. By February 1945, they were pushing into Germany itself. The last months of the war became a race. Soviet forces advanced from the east. American and British forces pushed from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. Hitler's thousand-year Reich was collapsing in fire and blood. But the fighting was not finished. German units trapped between the advancing Allies fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. On May 2, 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division freed Vubeline concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found there was unimaginable. About 3,500 to 4,000 prisoners, mere skeletons covered in skin, barely alive. About 1,000 dead bodies lying in open pits. Some evidence of cannibalism among the starving. The stench was unbearable. Men who had fought through 2 years of combat vomited at the sight. Burris shot the lock off a door to free prisoners. He was among the first Americans to see the horrors. He told his troops to document everything with photographs. The world needed to see this. The world needed proof of what the Nazi regime had done. Burris later said, "The concentration camp in Germany was the worst thing I saw during the entire war. The American army made the people of Ludwigslust tour the camp. German civilians were forced to see what had been done in their name." On May 7th, the 82nd Airborne held funeral services for 200 victims in the town square. Citizens of Ludwigslust captured German officers and several others. 100 American paratroopers attended. The division chaplain delivered a strong eulogy. The crimes committed here in the name of the German people and with their silent permission were small compared to what happened in other German concentration camps. Here there were no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men from Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France were simply allowed to starve to death. Within 4 miles of your comfortable homes, 4,000 men were forced to live like animals. Burris stood at attention during the service. He had seen terrible things in this war. Friends blown apart by artillery, men drowning in the wild river, the charnel house of Anzio, but nothing compared to Vubeline. Nothing showed the depths of human evil like that camp. He knew then that defeating Germany was not enough. The world needed to make sure this never happened again. By late April 1945, Allied commanders faced a strategic decision. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American forces had reached the Elbe River from the west. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered American troops to stop at the Elbe and let Soviet forces take Berlin. The political plans for post-war Germany had already been made at the Yalta Conference. Berlin would fall within the Soviet occupation zone. There was no military reason for American forces to fight their way into a city that would be handed to the Soviets anyway. But Burris hated the order. He was 25 years old. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years. Berlin was 40 miles away. The war was almost over, and he was supposed to just sit and wait. It went against everything in his nature. Boris was a man of action. Waiting was torture. On a day in late April, the exact date unknown, Boris made a decision. He later said he told his lieutenant and sergeant, "I cannot stand this any longer. Let us get in my jeep and drive across the river and see what we can see. See if there are some crowds still over there." It was not an official order. It was not an authorized reconnaissance. It was 3 paratroopers in a jeep driving into enemy territory because Boris was curious and restless. They drove about 40 miles, roughly halfway to Berlin. The roads were full of refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. German civilians pushed carts loaded with their belongings. Children cried. Old people stumbled along, exhausted. The social order in Germany had completely collapsed. Authority was gone. Fear ruled everything. Then, ahead on the road, Boris saw something that made his blood run cold. German military vehicles, dozens of them. No, hundreds. An entire column stretched as far as he could see. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, troop carriers, supply trucks. This was not a scattered group of deserters. This was an organized military formation. A full Panzer Corps, probably 15,000 troops or more. Boris should have turned around immediately. 3 men in a jeep had no business facing an armored corps. The smart choice was to retreat, report the enemy position, and let division headquarters decide what to do. But Boris did not become one of the most decorated officers in the 82nd Airborne by always taking the cautious path. He had a different idea, a crazy idea, an idea that made no logical sense, but it might just work. He drove straight toward the German column. His lieutenant and sergeant said nothing, but both checked their rifles. If this went wrong, they would go down fighting. The jeep rolled up to the lead vehicle in the column. A German officer stood beside it. Boris noticed the man wore a captain's insignia. He spoke English. That was lucky. Boris climbed out of the jeep and walked directly to the German captain. He kept his hand away from his sidearm. No aggressive moves, just confidence. Pure, absolute confidence. "I am here to accept your surrender," Boris announced. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As if he had not just driven 40 miles behind enemy lines with 2 other men to confront 15,000 German soldiers. The German captain stared at him in disbelief. He looked past Boris to the jeep. 2 men, 1 vehicle, no supporting troops, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. The captain's face showed confusion, then suspicion, then something close to amusement. He gestured at the jeep and the 2 Americans standing beside it. "Are you crazy?" he asked in heavily accented English. 3 men in a jeep? It was a fair question. Boris was indeed taking an extraordinary risk. But this was not a moment for rational thinking. This was a moment for audacity, for the kind of bluff Boris had been perfecting since he jumped into Sicily 2 years ago. He looked the German captain straight in the eye. "I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me," Boris said calmly. "And the Russians are right behind you. Do you want to surrender to us or to them?" It was a brilliant lie. There was no army of paratroopers behind Boris. There were no tanks. There was nothing but the same empty road they had driven down. But the German captain did not know that. And more importantly, the German captain desperately wanted to believe there might be an American army nearby, because if there was not, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets. And every German soldier knew what that meant. The Soviet Red Army had suffered unimaginable losses fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war. The Soviets had seen their cities burned, their people enslaved, their nation nearly destroyed. They advanced into Germany with a hunger for revenge that terrified German troops. Stories spread of mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and systematic reprisals. True or not, German soldiers believed them. The idea of Soviet captivity was a nightmare that haunted every Wehrmacht officer. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners humanely. They did not execute officers on sight. The German captain knew all this. As he stood in the road looking at Burris, he faced a choice. He could call the Americans' bluff, order his men to disarm these three paratroopers, continue the retreat toward wherever they were going, and eventually fall into Soviet hands. Or he could accept what this confident young captain was offering, a chance to surrender to the Americans, a chance to avoid the Red Army, a chance, however small, to survive this war. The German captain said, "Wait a minute." He turned and walked back. Down the column, Burris watched the German captain gather 3 or 4 other German officers. They formed a small group beside one of the vehicles and began an animated discussion. Burris could see them gesturing. Some pointed toward him, others pointed east toward the Soviet lines. The debate went on for several minutes. Burris stood perfectly still, his face showing total confidence. Inside, his heart pounded. This could go either way. Finally, the German captain broke away from the group and walked back to Burris. His hand moved toward his holster. Burris tensed. The lieutenant and sergeant in the jeep raised their rifles slightly. This was it. Either surrender or combat. The German captain pulled his pistol from the holster. For a brief moment, Burris thought, "Oh no, not here, in the last few days of the war." The captain held the pistol, pointed it at Burris's heart, then turned it around, gripped first, and extended it toward Burris, the universal sign of military surrender. Burris took the pistol. He nodded to the German captain. The captain saluted. The word spread down the column. "Surrender. The Americans have arrived. We are surrendering." German soldiers began getting off vehicles. They stacked their rifles. They put their sidearms on the ground. Officers organized their men into orderly groups. The discipline stayed even in defeat. This was still a professional military force, but it was a defeated one. Burris faced an immediate problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners and no way to guard them or move them. He had no communication with his division. He had 3 men and 1 jeep. The situation was ridiculous. He ordered the German officers to keep control of their troops and start marching west toward American lines. The Germans obeyed. Burris and his 2 men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear of the column like shepherds herding sheep. They drove for hours. The column of German soldiers stretched for miles. They passed through destroyed villages and abandoned checkpoints. Occasionally, they ran into American patrols who stared in amazement at the sight. Where did all these prisoners come from? The story spread quickly through American lines. Captain Burris had accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps with just a jeep and 2 other men. Nobody could believe it. When Burris finally reached 82nd Airborne Headquarters, his colonel was waiting. The colonel was not happy. Burris had disobeyed orders. He had driven into enemy territory without permission. He had taken huge risks. The colonel did not know whether to court-martial him or praise him. For several days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers argued he had shown a dangerous disregard for orders. Others pointed out that he had just captured 15,000 enemy soldiers without firing a single shot. In the end, the army decided that results mattered more than following procedure. Burris was recommended for commendation instead of punishment. Years later, when asked about the incident, Burris was typically modest. "I needed a plan and fast," he said. The plan was simple. Bluff with total confidence. Offer the Germans a choice between 2 outcomes, one clearly better, and hope they took the bait. It worked because Burris understood something important about military psychology. In April 1945, the German army was broken, not just militarily, but mentally. They knew the war was lost. They knew Hitler's promises were lies. They were terrified of the Soviets and exhausted from years of fighting. All they wanted was a way out. Burris gave them one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The 82nd Airborne Division received the honor of occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the paratroopers and gave the division a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Burris stood in formation as Patton spoke to them. "You are soldiers who jumped into hell and fought your way out." The war had changed him. At 25, he was a captain, a veteran of 4 major campaigns, and one of the most decorated officers in the airborne. But the war had also changed him in ways that would take years to understand. Burris returned to South Carolina after the war. He married, started a family, and went into the construction business. He worked at Roebuck Building Company in Spartanburg, South Carolina, for 15 years before starting his own firm. In 1970, at the urging of his family, Burris founded Burris Construction Company with his 3 sons, John, Hay, Moffett Jr., and Francis. The company took on major construction projects throughout the Southeast. Burris served as president from 1970 to 1987. In 1982, Burris Building Systems was founded as a division, then incorporated as a separate business in 1987 by his son, Moffett Burris Jr., from 1977 to 1990. Burris served in the South Carolina House of Representatives, representing Richland County. He brought the same leadership skills he learned in combat to civilian politics: direct, honest, and focused on results. His constituents appreciated a man who said what he meant and did what he said. He served as minority leader for 9 years and was key in building the modern Republican Party in South Carolina. He was the first minority leader in the State House of Representatives. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden. Actor Robert Redford played a composite character based partly on Burris and his actions at Naimi. Burris consulted on the film. Watching the recreation of the Wild River crossing brought the memories flooding back. He could still hear the machine guns, still see his men dying in the boats, still feel the cold water rising as the boat took more and more hits. In 2000, at age 80, Burris published his memoir, Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. The book was written at the urging and persuasion of his children. In the prologue, he wrote that he needed to come to terms with war by talking about it and reliving it with men who shared similar experiences. The book became essential reading for military historians and veterans alike. It was a first-hand account of what it meant to lead men in combat, what it cost, what it took, and what it left behind. On September 19, 1994, Burris made an airborne jump into Holland for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. He was 4 days shy of his 75th birthday, technically 74 years old. The jump was organized with Pathfinder Holland Reenactment Group at the original battle site in Naimi. 15 years later, in September 2009, he returned for the 65th anniversary and made a tandem jump at age 90, strapped to a female jumper from Pathfinder Holland. This 3-day commemoration included a 28-person entourage with family. He was honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and received the Naimi Medal of Honor from the Queen and the Mayor of Naimi. The people of Holland had not forgotten. Fresh flowers decorated monuments to the American soldiers who died liberating their country. Dutch children learned in school about the paratroopers who crossed the Wild River under fire. For Burris, those visits were deeply moving. The war had meaning because it had freed people from tyranny. The sacrifices were not wasted. In 2012, at age 92, Burris spoke at Fort Jackson's quarterly Profession of Arms luncheon for the Army Training Center. For nearly an hour, he held commanders, sergeants, majors, and staff spellbound as he told his combat experiences. He told them about shooting the lock off a concentration camp gate to free prisoners. He told them about convincing a German Panzer Corps to surrender. He told them about being among the first Americans to enter Berlin after Germany's surrender. The audience sat in total silence. They were witnessing history. They were hearing from a man who embodied everything the Army aimed to be. One officer who attended later said, "What resonated most with me as a commander was the simple message that good leaders need to lead from the front and should never expect anything from their soldiers that they would not do themselves." Because of his exceptional leadership, his men and others who served near him were able to overcome the impossible odds they faced and complete the missions they were given, even under the hardest conditions throughout the war. In his later years, Burris spoke often about leadership, duty, and service. He addressed military audiences, civic groups, and schools. His message was always the same: good leaders lead from the front. Never ask your people to do something you would not do yourself. Take care of your troops, and they will take care of you. These were not abstract ideas for Burris. They were lessons learned in blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of the 15,000 German troops, Burris always emphasized the context. It was not about him being brave or clever. It was about understanding the situation. Those German soldiers were terrified of the Soviets. They wanted to surrender to the Americans. All Burris did was give them the chance. Any officer who understood the psychology of the moment could have done the same thing. But very few officers had the audacity to try. His full military decorations included the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars with Combat V for Valor, Purple Heart, 3 Presidential Unit citations with 2 oak leaf clusters, French Fourragère, Belgian Fourragère, and Dutch Lanyard. The 82nd Airborne Division had an extraordinary combat record in World War II. 4 men from the division received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military award. The division earned 4 campaign streamers for action in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Central Europe. It liberated concentration camps, captured thousands of prisoners, and held critical objectives against overwhelming odds. Thomas Moffett Burris died on January 4, 2019, at age 99. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, including veterans who had served with him, politicians who had worked alongside him, and Dutch citizens who flew across the Atlantic to honor the man who helped liberate their country. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster said, "Moffett Burris is one of the finest leaders our state and nation has ever produced. He delivered freedom to people around the world and made the lives of those he touched better and safer." The story of Burris and the German Panzer Corps captured national attention when it was first reported. Newspapers called it one of the most audacious actions of the war. Military historians studied it as an example of psychological warfare and individual initiative. But Burris never sought fame for the incident. In interviews decades later, he was almost embarrassed by the attention. He insisted he was just doing his job, just trying to end the war without getting anyone killed. Yet the incident reveals something profound about military leadership and the nature of courage. True courage is not the absence of fear. It is the mastery of fear. Burris was surely afraid when he confronted that German column. Any sane man would be. But he controlled his fear. He projected confidence even when the situation seemed hopeless. He understood that warfare is ultimately psychological. Weapons matter, numbers matter, but mindset matters most. The German officers who surrendered to Burris were not cowards. They were trained professionals who knew when continued fighting was useless. They were trapped between 2 superpowers, their nation in ruins, their cause lost. Burris gave them a clear choice: surrender now to the Americans or be captured later by the Soviets. The fact that his bluff worked shows less about his trick and more about how desperate Germany was in April 1945. Some military analysts have questioned whether every detail of Burris's story is completely accurate. 15,000 troops is a suspiciously round number. Details about exact locations and dates are somewhat unclear. Burris himself admitted his memory of specific events had faded over the decades. Yet the core of the story cannot be disputed. After-action reports from the 82nd Airborne in late April 1945 document large numbers of German prisoners taken with very little resistance. Division records note that Captain Burris of I Company, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, was commended for actions involving German surrender. Multiple veterans from his unit remembered hearing about the incident shortly after it happened. What we know for sure is this: in the final days of the war in Europe, Thomas Moffett Burris encountered a large German military formation. Using only confidence and psychological pressure, He convinced them to surrender without a fight. The exact numbers may be uncertain. The precise details may have blurred over time, but the essential truth remains. One man's audacity achieved what an army might have struggled to accomplish with force. The lessons from Burris's experience go far beyond military history. They reveal basic truths about human psychology and decision-making. When people are trapped between bad options, they will seize any hope of a better outcome. When leaders project confidence, others follow even against their own judgment. When the cost of resistance seems higher than the cost of surrender, rational people will choose surrender. Burris understood these principles instinctively. He did not study psychology or negotiation tactics. He simply knew people, and that knowledge combined with extraordinary courage changed the outcome of one small moment in a vast war. The story also shows the chaos and unpredictability of war's final days. Military historians often focus on grand strategy, major battles, and decisive campaigns. But wars do not end neatly. In war, units often dissolve into confusion. Soldiers lose contact with headquarters. Men make decisions without orders. Authority breaks down. In that chaos, individuals like Burris could shape events in ways that would be impossible under normal military discipline. Think about what Burris did. He disobeyed direct orders to stay west of the Gila. He drove into enemy territory with no support and no way to communicate. He confronted a force that outnumbered him thousands to one. He lied about having reinforcements. He should have been killed or captured. Instead, he pulled off one of the most amazing bluffs in military history. That mix of audacity, confidence, and calculated risk is what makes exceptional leadership. Compare Burris's action to the British tank commander at Naimi. That officer had overwhelming firepower. He had clear orders to advance. All that stopped him was a single German anti-tank gun and his own hesitation. Burris, by contrast, had only a jeep and 2 other men. Yet, he succeeded where the heavily armed tank commander failed. The difference was mindset. Burris understood that in the fog of war, perception matters more than reality. If you can convince the enemy you have overwhelming force, you don't actually need it. In the decades after the war, Burris often thought about how close he came to death so many times. The jump into Sicily, landing under enemy fire. The Salerno campaign, bullets missing him by inches. The 2 wounds at Anzio that could have been fatal. The wild river crossing that killed half his company. The confrontation with 15,000 German soldiers that could have ended in execution. At any of those moments, his life could have ended. But he survived. His survival wasn't random luck. Burris survived because he was smart, trained harder than most, learned from every combat experience, and understood that leadership means taking the same risks you ask your men to take. Men followed him, not because he ordered them to, but because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That kind of leadership inspires loyalty that overcomes fear. When Burris spoke about the war later in life, he always focused on the men he served with, not himself. He talked about the privates who jumped into darkness over Sicily, the sergeants who held their squads together at Anzio, and the lieutenants who died leading their platoons across the river. For Burris, the story was never about him. It was always about them. The thousands of young Americans who answered their nation's call faced unimaginable hardships and helped defeat tyranny. In 2011, at age 91, Burris spoke to the United States Army Chaplain Basic Officer Leadership Course. In 2017, at age 97, he gave an interview to Fox News, sharing his wartime experiences with the same clarity and humility he had shown all his life. Even in his final years, he remained committed to teaching new generations the lessons of leadership and sacrifice. That was Burris's true legacy. Not the medals or decorations, not the dramatic stories or incredible risks. His legacy was the example he set, the standard of leadership he held, the way he treated his soldiers with respect and led them with courage. Young officers study his actions today, not because they are Hollywood-style heroic, but because they show what is possible when a leader combines skill with audacity. The jeep that Burris drove toward that German column no longer exists, scrapped decades ago like millions of other World War II vehicles. The road where he confronted 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt and modernized. The refugees who fled the Soviet advance are long gone. The German officers who surrendered that day have passed into history. But the story remains. It endures because it captures something essential about the human spirit. The refusal to accept defeat, the willingness to take impossible risks, and the understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon is confidence itself. In the final accounting of World War II, Thomas Moffett Burris was one soldier among 16 million Americans who served. His actions were one event among countless thousands, but his story shows what made the Allied victory possible. It was not just industry, weapons, or strategy. It was individual initiative. Soldiers like Burris saw an opportunity, took it without orders, and changed outcomes through pure audacity. When Burris died in 2019, he was one of the last surviving members of his generation. The men who jumped into Sicily are almost all gone. The paratroopers who crossed the wild river under fire have passed into memory. The veterans who liberated concentration camps and saw the true cost of Nazi ideology are disappearing. Soon, all that will remain are their stories. Stories like Burris's Bluff on a German road in April 1945. That story deserves to be remembered, not because it was typical, but precisely because it was not. Most surrenders involved long negotiations, superior force, and clear military advantage. Burris's surrender involved none of that. It was just 3 men in a jeep facing 15,000 enemy soldiers. It should not have worked. But Burris did not care about what should or should not work. He knew that at the end of a war, the old rules no longer applied. He knew desperate men will believe what they want to believe. He knew that confidence spreads, and that a bold bluff is stronger than a cautious retreat. So remember this story. Remember the school teacher from South Carolina, who became one of the most decorated paratroopers in American history. Remember the captain who jumped into combat 4 times and led from the front every time. Remember the man who crossed a river under fire, lost half his company, and kept fighting. Remember the officer who faced 15,000 enemy soldiers with nothing but nerve and convinced them to surrender. Remember Thomas Moffett Burris. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Remember that leadership means standing where you ask others to stand. Remember that sometimes the impossible is just the improbable waiting for someone brave enough to try it. Remember that 3 men in a jeep, armed only with confidence and a well-timed bluff, can change the course of history. That is the lesson of April 1945. That is the legacy of one remarkable American soldier. That is what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances and refuse to believe impossible means unable to try. The jeep rolled down that German road with 3 men inside. They faced an army. They should have died. Instead, they won. And in that small victory, even in the huge scale of World War II, we see the real measure of American military success. Not just superior weapons, not just industrial power, but the boldness of soldiers who refused to believe they were outnumbered, even when they knew they were.